Good evening, everyone. My name is Anita Slade, and I'm a library assistant here at River Falls Public Library. Tonight, I am thrilled to introduce author Victoria Houston. She's the author of 19 Loon Lake Mysteries set in the Northwoods of Wisconsin against a background of fishing, fly fishing, as well as fishing for muskie, bass, bluegill, walleyes. Her first Lou Harris book, Wolf Hollow, came out in January, and her second book, Lou book, Hidden in the Pines, will be out this next January. She has also written and co-authored over 7 nonfiction books. Her talk tonight may or may not cover the 3 major life mistakes she's made that force her to write fishing mysteries. So welcome, Victoria, and we will answer questions at the end.
Thank you. Thank you, folks. I also want to introduce Brian, who is here from Chapter Books. Thank you very much for coming down. And yes, thanks, Anita. The title of my talk is, as she just mentioned, the 3 major life mistakes I've made, not counting my ex-husbands, that forced me to write these fishing mysteries. And I'm going to talk to you about the process, really, of writing these books. And then, as Anita mentioned, we will open for questions. And I have to tell you, I've had a heck of a day because I was sharing with Anita. I had expected to land at a friend's house in New Richmond this afternoon early, only the car decided to stop working with a small explosion in Thorpe, Wisconsin. So I was able to get it to the Toyota dealer in Chippewa Falls, and that's where it is. So later, I'm going to celebrate making it tonight by having some walleye and some ice cream. But anyway, to go back to the beginning, I am originally from Rhinelander, Wisconsin. That's where I grew up. And of course, at 18, I couldn't wait to leave town. And then 30 years later, I moved back. And I thought I'd stay for 6 months. And that was 25 years and 21 books ago. So anyway, but growing up in Rhinelander was interesting. And it's a population at that time of 8,000 people. I'm not sure what the population of River Falls is, but a small community and very much paper mill town. And in going to grade school there, St. Mary's, received a very good education. And even as like a middle schooler, you know, I found I really enjoyed writing. And I'm probably one of the few people at that age, especially, who actually enjoyed diagramming a sentence. But I enjoyed reading a lot and writing. And by the time I was in 8th grade, I'd won a couple, you know, sort of local and actually won statewide prizes just for poetry and for stories. Then in high school, I went on and I continued to work. Again, I was very fortunate. I had really good high school teachers. And we had quite a focus on writing. And as a result of that, I ended up winning a scholarship, a full scholarship, to a school in Vermont, Bennington College. And at the time, it was the most expensive college in the United States. So I was rather full of myself. And my grandparents were lovely. They drove me out to Vermont to my new college. And Bennington at the time was very small. I mean, it's still not a large school, but it was all women. And I walk into my first class. It was a literature class, and it was taught by a very famous author, Bernard Malamud, who at the time was working on the book that would eventually win him the Pulitzer Prize. And in fact, Bennington College was a very arts-oriented school. So it had a lot of people who became very well known in contemporary art, like Helen Frankenthaler, and again, like Bernard Malamud in literature, and famous women who were um, in modern dance. And anyway, it was that kind of a place. So I walk into this first class, and there's this, and the classes were small. There were only maybe 6 or 7 girls in this class. And this girl looks at me and she says, "So, where have you been published?" And I'm kind of taken aback. I mean, I hadn't been published in the Rhinelander Daily Snooze. And so I countered. I've always been good at countering. "Where have you been published?" "The New Yorker." So that pretty much put me in my place. And Bennington was also a very interesting school. As I said, it was very arts oriented. So coming from northern Wisconsin, where I'd only ever seen pictures of duck and deer and bear, suddenly I'm looking at all this very contemporary art. And also I'm becoming familiar with the fact that the other girls who are at school with me, most of them are from New York City, a few from Los Angeles, but they're from, major metropolitan areas. So for me, it was a real introduction to the realities of the professional life as an artist, much less as a writer. So I didn't really think of myself at that time as someone for whom writing would be a profession. But I did have one very interesting experience, which really shaped my work and does so to this day, which was I was taking a philosophy course, and Bennington didn't give grades. They just gave you comments. And so I was meeting with the philosophy teacher, Miss Schlabach, and I had turned in a paper on Deuteronomy. And she said to me, "Your paper's good." She said, "You've, repeated to me everything you've read in your research and everything that you've taken notes on." She said, "You've repeated that great, but there's no original thinking here. I want you to go back to your room. I want you to take all those index cards where you did all that research, throw those on the floor, rewrite this paper without looking at them." And so I did. And what I came up with was original thinking. And to this day, when I am working on a book, what I do at the front end of that book is I do my thinking about who my characters are going to be in that story, what's going to be maybe happening to them. Since fishing, background's my story. What is the season? What's going on with the fishing? And I keep all those notes. And also, I'm just a fanatic newspaper reader. So I get a lot of my ideas. I'm one of the few people. I get the daily print edition of the New York Times, the daily print edition of the Wall Street Journal, and I get the Washington Post online. And then, a couple other magazines, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, and I save those stories and I take those notes. And before I actually start writing, I metaphorically throw them all on the floor, and then I get started. And so that experience at Bennington really worked extremely well for me. But anyway, I go on, I marry after my sophomore year of college. We end up, my husband, myself, and 2 young kids, moving to a suburb of Chicago, Northbrook. So now I'm in Northbrook, Illinois, and I've got 2 kids in elementary school, and I've made good friends. Usually all my friends in that time were mothers of other kids of the same age. So I became really good friends with Joni. Now, as I got to know Joni, who lived just a block from me, I found out, actually, I was mesmerized by the fact that Joni's husband was a criminal defense lawyer in Chicago, and Joni knew that he was having an affair with one of his associates. Joni, who is from Lake Forest and a very wealthy family, she wasn't behaving very well either. So I'm watching all this and I'm thinking, there's a story in this. I mean, this is like as good as Peyton Place. And so I proceed to make my first big mistake. I'm 50 pages into writing about Joni and her husband when suddenly they go into marriage counseling. And before you know it, they're these very lovely Christians, just boring as hell. And what I learned is never base a character on a real person. And I like to quote one of my favorite writers, Willa Cather. And she says, writers write from the memories they have from before the age of 13. And for me, that's very true. And so if you've read any of my books, or if you're going to read my books, you know that there are three main characters. Well, let's talk about Doc Osborne, okay? This retired dentist who had, his late wife was just miserable, okay? My father was a dentist. My grandfather was a dentist. He settled in Rhinelander in 1924. My uncle was a dentist. Now, I worked in the dental office when I was a teenager, and teeth are still one of the best ways to identify a dead body. Both my dad and my uncle, now my dad married a second wife after my mother died. My uncle went through a divorce and then married a second wife. They both married these perfectly awful women. And so it's so funny because I had an editor from New York City call me up after I finished the second book in the series, which was Dead Creek. And she said, I really think readers they aren't going to like the way you handle the late wife of Doc Osborne. Well, I was having my book vetted for accuracy for fly fishing detail by a guy who is the head of water quality for the DNR in our region and an expert fly fisherman. So after he read the book and I'm going over a few changes he suggested with him, I said, now, Bob, as you read that book, do you think I've made Doc's late wife too mean? And he said, hell no. I know lots of guys with wives like that. So anyway, then my character, Lou Ferris, who is now the main character, is my series. We've done a spin-off with Wolf Hollow. She is the main point of view for most of the book. Lou Ferris is distilled from memories I have of a favorite high school teacher, a woman who was a fanatic fisherman. And like in the 60s, that was not that common. And also two girls that grew up in the same neighborhood where I grew up. And they were about 4 years older than I was. And they used to beat me up all the time. And one of them, I got caught saying this on the radio on the Larry Mueller show. One of them went on to become the chancellor of the University of Minnesota in Duluth. And my comment was, where she's still beating people up, Her brother was listening. So she heard about that. But anyway, she took it with a grain of salt. But anyway, then my third main character, Ray Pratt, who's about a 32-year-old fishing guide, a very talented in fishing, very talented tracker, but the guy tells the most inappropriate jokes. And he also has a problem with weed, okay? Well, he is distilled from memories of one of my brothers. I'm the oldest of 8 kids. One of my brothers, 2 of my cousins from Stevens Point. And they always hunted and fished together. So he's distilled from memories of who they were in their, late teens, early 20s. But I will say my brother should know better. He's still telling inappropriate jokes. And I have 2 nieces and a nephew, and I would go for Easter breakfast at their house. Let's go 10 years ago. And my brother would be there, and all of a sudden he'd open up with one of those jokes. And I found out later the kids loved to just watch my face because I would just I did not laugh. But anyway, having, started the story about Joni and her husband and discovering that I'd made that big mistake, I had a neat thing happen. One of my sisters came through to visit, and she had at that point become an actress out in Los Angeles. And she was married to a man who was also in the movie business and who was in the midst of developing a film project with a screenwriter who was a well-known writer. And my sister read my 50 pages, and she thought they were pretty good. Now, today she teaches AP English, so she's always been a reader. And she showed them those pages to the screenwriter they were working with, and then he graciously sent them to his editor at the Atlantic Monthly Press. And I got this wonderful rejection letter. It said, "When I read this material, which is not publishable, I thought you do show promise. What you need to do is get out there and do a lot of magazine and newspaper work." So I took that to heart. And at that point, my family made a change. We moved to Kansas City, which was the hometown of my first husband. For the record, guys, I've only had 2 ex-husbands. And we'll talk about the second one in a bit too. But anyway, when we got there, I just really put myself out to start to do freelance writing. And this was the era when newspapers were still big, magazines were still big, and I landed a couple of really good assignments. And one in particular was interesting. I was working for the Kansas City Magazine, and they called me up and they said, "We'd like you to do a profile of this man who's running for office for the U.S. Senate in Missouri." Well, he was based in Kansas City. His name was Morgan Maxfield, and he was being touted as being a brilliant businessman. He worked for Lamar Hunt, who owned, of course, Kansas City, I think the Royals at the time, or the Chiefs. I get my football, my baseball mixed up. I'm sorry. But anyway, he was also getting a lot of press for being the most eligible bachelor in town. So I was kind of pleased that I would have this assignment. Now, because my first husband was in banking, commercial banking, we used to entertain people a lot who were involved with other businesses in the city. So we were at dinner with this couple, and the wife's, I mentioned I was going to do a profile of Morgan Maxfield, and the wife said, "Well, I used to babysit for him. I'm from Dallas, and that's where he's from." She said, "Why don't you do some background check with the Dallas reporters and see what they can help you with?" So I called the Dallas Morning News, and I ended up being transferred to a reporter there who actually had just won a Pulitzer Prize because he covered he was standing there when Jack Ruby shot Oswald after, the whole Kennedy thing. And this reporter came on. His name was, I forget his name. Anyway, I told him I was doing research on Morgan Maxfield. And he said, "Why are you doing that?" And I said, "Well, he's running for the U.S. Senate up here." And he said, "Well, tell me more." And I said, "Well, he's considered just a brilliant businessman because of his involvement with Lamar Hunt. And he's the most eligible bachelor in Kansas City." He said, "Well, that's interesting." Hugh Ainsworth, that was this guy's name. And I just don't want to forget it because he won a Pulitzer Prize, for heaven's sakes. I said, well, he said, that's very interesting that he's introduced himself that way because he's got a wife and 2 kids down here. Oh, so now I called the publisher of Kansas City Magazine and I said, I think we've got a big story. And he said, forget about it. I said, what? He said, that guy and his connection to Lamar Hunt, if I print anything negative, they'll put me out of business. I said, oh, okay. Now, in the meantime, I had also started to do art reviews for the Kansas City Star, the big newspaper in town. And so I called one of the reporters, one of the news reporters at the Star, and I told him what Hugh Ainsworth had told me. Furthermore, I said, Hugh Ainsworth is FedExing some documents that will, underscore this information. And so I handed the story to the newspaper. They broke it. And guess who did not get elected to the U.S. Senate? So he calls me one morning because now I have taken a job as a copy editor for wire service for the futures markets. And I get this phone call one morning from Morgan Maxfield. And he said, I understand you gave all that information to the reporters at the Star. He said, I'm going to sue you. I said, really? I said, well, why don't you just try? Because I will sue you for libel. End of conversation. So I got off that phone call and I thought, I wasn't sure if I should be worried or not. Well, this was a period of time and where, I was doing the freelance work here. I was doing the art criticism over here for the paper. And then I was hired to work on a political referendum on behalf of the railroads. And in doing that, I became first their researcher and then their spokesperson. And because I was their spokesperson and it was a statewide referendum, I was flying in small planes around to different cities to give talks. And I'm in this one plane and this pilot says to me, it was a small plane. He said, now you were involved with that story on Morgan Maxfield, right? And I said, yeah. I said, the paper broke it. He said, well, yeah, but the word got out that, you're the one who did the research. And he said, I think there's something you should know. He keeps his private plane right next to mine. And he said, he doesn't take care of it. It's dangerous. And sure enough, within a matter of weeks, Morgan Maxfield was flying some other people with him to Las Vegas, and that small plane went down and all 6 people were killed. So it was pretty interesting, and I did not have to worry about being sued. But as I was doing the work there in Kansas City then, I was assigned a very difficult story for the Kansas City Star Sunday magazine. And the subject of the story was sexual abuse of children. And it was a tough story, but I had a very good source. I had a very good social worker who really guided me through the interviews and the background information. We put the story together. It sort of won the paper a lot of awards. And then one day she knocked on my door, the social worker, Helen. And she said, I was wondering if you'd write a book with me. And I was a little taken aback. And she said, my real, expertise is in working with latchkey kids. And I want to do a book for latchkey parents. And I stopped for a minute. Now, at this point, I had left my first marriage. And so I was a single mom, and I was very much a latchkey parent. And I said, Helen, latchkey parents don't have time to read books. I'll work with you if we can write it for the kids. So Helen and I got together and we wrote a book really aimed, called Home Alone, and really aimed at latchkey kids, which was great. And in doing that, I picked up my agent and I began to learn a little bit more about the publishing business. But I also took a new job, and that job was with a new publisher in Kansas City. And we published cartoonists, famous cartoonists, although they were not famous yet. They were on their way up, and this was really a startup company. And so I was working with Gary Trudeau in Doonesbury, Gary Larson in The Far Side, the guy who did Calvin and Hobbes. And I also worked with Dear Abby and Irma Bombeck. And my job then as the head of PR for this startup publishing company was to go to New York City and try to get the producers of the talk shows to book our people on their shows. So I spent a lot of time schmoozing, like producers at Donahue, Sally Jesse Raphael, Diane Sawyer. This was before Oprah, for the record. And one of my selling points usually when I talked to the producers was to just kind of make friends with them. And I sort of did that by just inviting them to very expensive restaurants, because even if they didn't like me, they'd still like to go to the restaurant. So anyway, one day, as I'm at work, I get a phone call from a producer, senior producer at Donahue. And in making friends with them, I had shared the fact that, I'd been through a divorce and I had just recently remarried a guy who was 9 years younger than me. And I was pretty embarrassed about that. And so this woman, Gail, called me up and she said, Vicki, I know your husband's quite a bit younger than you are. And Phil, we're booking Cher on the show. What are some questions Phil can ask her? Well, I had really not talked to anybody about my, kind of acute embarrassment of this age difference. And so I really unburdened my heart. And after about 20 minutes, she said, I just scratched Cher. I want you on the show. So, oh my God, I'm going to be on the Donahue show. So now I end up in the green room at the Donahue show. And, my 9 years younger spouse is there. But there were 4 other couples there. And the average age difference was that the women were at least 10 years older than the husband. One couple, she was 25 years older. And these were normal, nice people. And as I'm standing there, I thought, there's a book in this. So I call my agent, and within 3 weeks, we have a book. And I interviewed at least 20 couples. And then over the coming years, many more. But we published a book, Loving a Younger Man, How Women Are Finding and Enjoying a Better Relationship. And it did really well. It put my 3 kids through college. But anyway, in working on that book, I became very familiar, with more of the realities of book publishing, and certainly did not give up my day job. So I'm sitting in an editorial meeting at Andrews and McNeil, and we were publishing, along with the cartoonists and along with Irma and Dear Abby, we were publishing one mystery writer. And he announced to the group at that editorial meeting that he had just gotten a $100,000 advance for his next mystery. Well, I was really surprised, because even though Loving a Younger Man did well, trust me, my advance on that book was probably $2,500. And to a girl from Rhinelander, $100,000 is a lot of money. So I take his mystery home. I got to read it. I'm going to promote it. It was mediocre. And I thought, you know, for 100,000, I can be mediocre. So I make my second big mistake. I decide to write a mystery. I decide it will be easy to write a mystery. So I start. And my work methods haven't changed too much over the years. What I do is, at that time, because of having children and a husband, which is like having another child, I would carve out an hour in the morning, usually from hour to an hour and a half, 5 to 6:30 to work on a book, and then go on with the rest of the day. To this day, I still will have a full pot of coffee. Got a little excited there. I'll have a full pot of coffee in the morning, and then I'll work writing for about an hour, hour and a half. That is the maximum for that kind of subconscious thinking. That's still going to be good thinking. Hold on one sec. I'll see if I can get this back in here. Here's our Savior. I don't know what I did.
Oh, broke.
Oh, well, then I'll hold it.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay. The car broke, and now this broke. If the ice cream breaks, because, you know, bad things always happen in threes, then I'll be really upset. But anyway, so I worked for a full year, and I sent off this manuscript, a mystery, to my agent. She sent it back. She said it has a few problems. I thought, I can fix it. Well, the fourth time I sent it to her, she said, this is so bad. Don't even show this to someone who loves you unconditionally. She said, face it, you're a nonfiction writer, not a mystery writer. Oh, well, okay. At that point in my life, I'm 42. I really enjoyed trying to write a mystery. It was a different kind of thinking from doing research and nonfiction. And I had another fortunate thing happen to me. In my work, again, I found myself in New York City. I was in the office of Newsweek magazine. We had Gary Trudeau coming back from a sabbatical. My job was to get him the cover story on a national magazine. And I had already been turned down at Time. And so I was desperate to get him on the front of Newsweek. And I'm in talking to the book editor. And he was a very kind of introverted individual. And I was having a hard time kind of getting him to open up and chat. And I thought, if I can't get him to be comfortable with me and talk, I have no hope of pitching Gary. So out of desperation, I asked what felt like a stupid question. I said, if you review books, does that mean you write them too? And now, to be perfectly honest, most writers have a very low opinion of reviewers. So, you know, it was kind of like thinking, of course he doesn't write books, for God's sake. But anyway, he responded and said, yes, I write mysteries. Oh my God, I said, I have been trying for 4 years to write a mystery. I've done a terrible job. And he said, well, maybe you'd like to come to this workshop that I go to in the village. And then he told me more about it. And we talked. And I got Gary on the cover of Newsweek. But what I also did was I booked my meetings in New York always Monday, Tuesday, because the workshop was held on Monday nights. And I went to that for the next year. And she only gave us one assignment. Now, there were very rarely more than about 6 or 8 people there, and everyone had a day job. So when people came with their assignment to read, they only had 2 or 3 pages to read. And the assignment was to write the autobiography of a character and come to class and read out loud. And what she was trying to tell us, it sounds like a cliche, but it is the heart of it. She was trying to tell us how to show, not tell, on the page. And I'll give you an example. You can write, Margie woke up that morning feeling crabby. Sounds logical. You have a kind of a sense. Or Margie woke up that morning, and before she opened her eyes, she put her left foot on the floor and realized she'd forgotten to let the puppy out last night. And as she slid across the floor, she tripped and banged her elbow on the dresser. When she got to the kitchen, it didn't help that she'd forgotten to buy coffee. And so you now have Margie in very bad shape. But it goes a lot better that way than saying she woke up feeling crabby. Well, it only took me about 9 months to figure this out and how to write this way. And I taught a class. I taught a summer class on mystery writing several years ago, and I prepared the students for the fact that this would be very difficult for them to learn, and that after the class, I'd be happy they could email me stuff, and I'd help them get through and reach that point of knowing how to show, not tell. And they all did it in one day. They figured it out. So I think I'm a better teacher sometimes than a student. But anyway, I finally figured it out. And so now I start a mystery. I set it in Kansas City because that's where I lived for 15 years. I set it against a background of art theft because I was the art critic eventually for the Kansas City Star. And I have, my main character she's 42, beautiful, brilliant, intrepid, just like me. And I'm getting into the story, and I'm about 45 pages into the story when things change. And one of the things I have learned in my writing now is I am not the type of writer who plots. I have some ideas of where my story's going before I start, and I will do a 1.5-page synopsis of what I think the story is. But my stories, I know, will change markedly midway through that book. I just don't know until I get there how that change is going to happen. So anyway, at this point, with this effort, I'm 45 pages into it when that stolen art ends up at the bottom of a lake in northern Wisconsin. And a retired dentist is out in his fishing boat with his dog in the boat, scouting for good musky water. And as he comes over this one area, he can see just below the surface something strange that doesn't belong there. And that's when I got the news that Mystery Writers of America had a mentor program. And if you would send in 50 pages, a published author would take a look at your work and give you some advice. So I rushed those 50 pages off thinking, well, I won't get a critique. I'm sure I'll get a contract. Well, when I got it back, the person who critiqued it said, when I started to read this material, I was going to suggest this writer go back to school. But when the story turned to Wisconsin, it just came alive. It just sparkled. So I threw away 45 pages. I looked at Doc Osborne, his dog, his fishing boat, and I thought, let's see where this takes us. And that was 21 books ago. So it took me another 2.5 years to write what was the first book in the series. And during that time, I left my second marriage. But I do want to say something before I go any further. The second marriage to the much younger man, he was an investigative reporter who covered a lot of murders. And we're going to go back to this in a few minutes, because when I was here at the River Falls a number of years ago, I talked about this and something very interesting happened. So we're going to go back and talk about it in a few minutes. But anyway, he covered a lot of murders, and by virtue of just being there and watching and listening, I learned a great deal about how law enforcement works, about how autopsies are handled, and very much certainly about the people who commit murder, for sure. But anyway, I turned in a book with the title Dead Creek to my agent, and with an apology. And at this point, I had moved back to Rhinelander initially to help with my father's estate. I had left that marriage, and I thought, well, I'll just be in Rhinelander for 6 months, then I'll go to Chicago or Minneapolis and work in PR. But when I got up there, a small publishing house got in touch with me and said, would you help us out? Come on board. You've got the background in sales and marketing, and we could use your help. And I was intrigued because they did books on Labrador retrievers, musky fishing, and fly fishing. And through them, I was able to meet Joan Wolfe, who is just an icon in the world of fly fishing. And I was personally very interested in taking up fly fishing. And so through her, I went twice to her schools out east and kind of was able to begin to get into that sport. So meanwhile, I'm working that kind of information into Dead Creek. Also, growing up, my dad always told us the reason he practiced dentistry was so he could afford to fish. And one summer he caught 17 muskie, and he would wake us up, in the middle of the night just to get up and see a wonderful 25-inch walleye, so I kind of grew up in that culture. But anyway, I send off this book to my agent with the apology that I'm certainly no one wants the series set against a background of fishing. Well, she got back to me and she said, it's not bad, but editors would like series. Do you think you could use these characters in a few more books? Well, I was so happy with the characters I developed that all it took was a glass of wine, and I had ideas for, 2 more books in the series. So she sent it off to Berkeley, and she got back to me and she said, the editor there wants to talk to you. So I get on the phone with this editor, Sarah. Sarah, by the way, went to Bennington College. And Sarah said, I really like your story, but we can't use it. We publish cozies. I said, what's a cozy? And she said, well, a cozy has no graphic violence, no graphic sex, and no use of the F word on the page. I said, I don't have that. She said, yeah, but you got another problem. She said, the marketing team said, no hermaphrodites. So here was the issue. As I said earlier, I read the daily New York Times and the daily Wall Street Journal print editions and get ideas from them. Well, the New York Times had done a big story on water quality issues over in the Green Bay area, and specifically how the esters from the pulp industry in the late 1800s remain in the water system and cause hermaphroditic life forms. I kind of sped it up and had from the birds and the fish, and I kind of, accelerated into human beings. Well, that's what the marketing team didn't like. So I said, it's okay, I can fix it, I can fix it. And she said, I don't know how you can fix it without ruining your mystery. Well, what she didn't know was that I was also working as a book doctor for some people. And I had co-authored for a nationally prominent doctor who is an endocrinologist, OBGYN, who had written a book on hormones for postmenopausal women. And so by virtue of helping him translate his medicalese into, easy to read English, I knew more about estrogen and testosterone than your average person. So I was able to go in and scale back the health issues so that the marketing team could breathe easily. But in the meantime, they had me write a different book using my same characters. And so in the Loon Lake series, Dead Angler is the first, and Dead Creek is published second. Well, the marketing team, as I continued to get contracts to write more books, they kept deciding on the titles. So we had Dead Creek, Dead Angler, Dead Water, and then I knew I was in trouble because Dead Duck had to be right around the corner. And that's when, for the series, then I started to use the names of trout flies or fishing lures in my titles. And in retrospect, as I mentioned, my father was a fisherman, and I should say one other thing. Sarah, the editor at Berkeley, did tell me, she said, we decided a couple years ago we wanted a series set against a background of fishing. And she said, I went to all the leading outdoors writers for the magazines like Outdoor Life and Sports Afield. And she said, everyone sent me the same material. They all had a fishing guide in Montana, and they all told the story. They didn't show the story. Well, I mean, who needs Montana, for God's sake? So Wisconsin kind of hit her right too. But, having grown up in that culture, for me personally, as a kid, I fished from the age of 5. We even had a nice fish pond in the center of town, Rhinelander, and my mom would just shoot us out the door in the morning with our little tackle box and our bamboo rod and send us down to fish. And of course, my story is that when I hit the age of 12, I gave up fishing for boys. And but then at 50, I saw the light and I gave up boys for fishing. And again, it was just such a gift to run into Joan Wolf and be able to go to the Wolf School of Fly Fishing and learn a lot. Plus, just make a lot of friends in Trout Unlimited. And it's just, I don't have to tell people here, how glorious it is to be outside by water. And of course, the neat thing when you're writing about fishing is that when you're fly fishing, you're in the water. When you're bait fishing, you're on the water. So you've got two very different experiences. And what I like to say about fly fishing, especially up where I was fishing up around Rhinelander, you are free to wade the stream or the river. That's public property. But the minute you step out, that is not. And you never know if those are landowners who eat their young or not, And even as a kid, I remember my dad saying to me as a young girl, he'd say, if you're out with the boys, don't ever go down a road that has no fire sign, be very careful out there. So anyway, then a couple years ago, after Simon & Schuster had acquired a lot of my books, then I decided, and they decided, that the Loon Lake Mystery Series had sort of run its course. And I took a year off. And then after being out in California for a while, I have a son who lives in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which is a gorgeous area. I have a son in Burbank who's a comedy game show writer. And after being around my sons and their families for a little bit, I came back and I felt energized. And I thought, I'd like to write some more. And I called my friend who's been sort of my executive editor over all these years. He had always published my books under the umbrella of a larger corporation. And his last company then had been sold to Simon & Schuster, which is how I ended up there. So I called Ben to see if an old friend of his, who he had mentioned, was still in mystery publishing. And before I could get the words out, he said, "No, I want your book. I want your book. I joined that company and I want your book." And the company is Crooked Lane Books. And they now publish the new book, Wolf Hollow. And Brian has some of that tonight. And they asked two things. They wanted they wanted to have Lou Ferris be the primary character. And they wanted also to change the titles so that they would be different from the Loon Lake series. And I was very comfortable with that. And just to wind up, going back to the third mistake, back when I did that book where I started it in Kansas City, what I had there was a main character. And I can't remember if I was writing in the first person or not. But what I have discovered is I have to have distance from my characters. So, I really am a third person narrator, if that makes sense to you. And so you'll hear Lou Ferris's point of view, and you may see some other points of view, but you don't have a character that's like me in these books. So now I want to go back to my Little River Falls story. So anyway, I'm living in West Hartford, Connecticut in my second marriage. And I'm married to the investigative reporter. And my youngest son is just starting in a new middle school. And we have just moved to West Hartford. So early in the morning, have him in the car. Someone had given me directions on how to avoid the main streets and go back past the high school to the middle school. And as I'm driving along, I see a small compact car that has run into a telephone pole. It's smashed into the telephone pole. And my first thought, being from Wisconsin, was, somebody got drunk. So I keep on going. I take my son to school and I come back. This time, there are all these people standing around that little compact car. And a couple of them are people wearing trench coats, which tells me I'm looking at law enforcement here. So I get home and I call my investigative reporter husband, who is then upset because that could be a breaking story. He wished, why didn't I call him before? But anyway, turns out there was a body in that car. It was a woman. And this was winter. All she was wearing was a pair of panties. Well, as the police officers are checking this out, one of the police officers is a woman. And as they got in touch, they figured out what the victim's name was, and they called and reached her husband. And he said, well, she's been really depressed and she just drove off by herself last night. Well, the police officer, who was the woman, said, I don't care how depressed she is. She wouldn't go out in the cold in just her panties. There's more to this. Well, there certainly was. The husband turned out to be a physician, a surgeon, at the hospital there in West Hartford. And it turns out the couple had had a big fight the night before. And I'm not making this up. He beat her to death with the statue of the Virgin Mary. And then he threw her out the window. And they had two little boys asleep in a nearby bedroom who were not aware of this, apparently. But anyway, then the husband rethought having thrown his wife out the window, and he went down and he picked up what he felt, left any debris or anything, and he put her in the car, drove around the corner, ran it into the telephone pole and left her there, and thought he had a great story. Well, they caught up with him and they charged him with murder. And the end of the story was he was convicted. And I'm telling this story in River Falls that night, and a woman in the audience says, I was on the jury. Yeah, and she was here in River Falls visiting a family member, and she had been on the jury for that case out in West Hartford, Connecticut, which is pretty funny. The real ending to the story is the guy appealed, got out, and a hospital in Philadelphia hired him as a surgeon. They never did any background check on the guy. So, but anyway, but that kind of gives you an idea of how I have developed my mystery series and, where I've come from in terms of establishing my characters. And now I'd like to open for questions.
When you left the college after you graduated,
Yeah.
what was your first job then?
Well, after I graduated, I was, well, first of all, I didn't graduate. I left after my sophomore year, and I got married that summer. And I was working in Cambridge, Massachusetts, because my first husband went to Harvard Business School. And so I worked in a retail shop there. And then, of course, I had the children, and I didn't really work until we moved to Kansas City. And the kids were like in first and second grade. And that's when I started doing the freelance writing and getting paid for it, as opposed to the attempt to write about Joni and her husband. So, and then I've been working ever since. And today, even as I do the mystery series, I still do some consulting, HR consulting, for a good friend of mine who runs a company. I don't know if you're familiar with Uline. Yeah. And we do not share the same politics, but we're good friends. Yeah.
Were you born and raised in Rhinelander? We got here a little late.
Yeah, very much so. Yes.
Because we lived in Tomahawk for 10 years.
Well, what years were you in Tomahawk?
Well, it was after you were born and raised in Rhinelander, but my wife has read all of your books.
Oh. The reason I ask is, well, my dad's best friend, Dr. Richard Jarvis, lived in Tomahawk. And so it was funny because as kids, well, I'll tell you a couple of things. As kids, and again, I'm the oldest of 8 kids born within 10 years. And my parents, we would have like Easter lunch would be over at the Jarvises in Tomahawk. And then they'd come over and my parents used to have poker night, and Ruth and Dick Jarvis would come for that. And Dick and my dad were big fishermen together, and he was an MD in Tomahawk. And, you look at family dysfunction. My parents had a way of always forgetting my middle sister, Michelle. So we'd get over to the Jarvises in Tomahawk. This was 30 miles away. And everyone would look around, and we'd left Michelle back there, back in Rhinelander. And I can tell you, we've all paid the price over the years. But but Dick Jarvis and his wife were at my parents' house one night, and I was 5 years old, and they had a big poker party going on downstairs, and I had not felt good that day. And I remember this so vividly. I fell down the stairs, and Dr. Jarvis examined me, called an ambulance, and I am the first person to survive spinal meningitis in Wisconsin, bacterial meningitis, because they had just started using penicillin after World War II. And so, yeah, and I have a lot of memories of Tomahawk too. So,
We lived right on Lake Alice.
well, good for you. Neat.
It was wonderful. We were born and raised in River Falls,
So you're happy to be back.
very much so.
Good. Good. It's like I'm happy to be back in Rhinelander. It's funny. Home has a good ring to it. Yes.
So who's Ray?
Well, Ray is distilled from the memories of my brother, John, and two of my cousins from Stevens Point. And I had mentioned this before you guys got here tonight. And who they were in their late teens, early 20s. Very outdoorsman, still very much so. But my point is that the brother still tells the inappropriate jokes, and I tame them down for the books. I mean, really, he called me not too long ago and he told me a joke, and I was silent. And he said, "You don't like it?" I said, "One, it's racist. And number two, it's anti-women. No, I don't like it. No." So,
What would you say that your ratio to writing and fishing is now that you've had so many books out?
well, I have to, I ran into an issue with my vision. I had a couple detached retinas. So where, let's say 10 years ago, I would have said probably 30% fishing, 30% writing or related to the writing, and 30%, doing other stuff, doing some cooking and all that kind of stuff. But for about 15 years, I did a lot of fishing. And I just, for two reasons. Number one, I found it just such a great background for my books. Number two, I just love it. And I live in the summer and I work on a computer at my cottage. My cottage was built in 1894. It's 500 square feet. And it abuts the property my grandfather owned when I was growing up. And I'm 20 feet from Moon's Lake, First Lake. And the Moon's chain is a great chain. It's 5-lake chain with excellent muskie fishing. And so, I just have spent a lot of time there. Today, it's hard for me because I can't see to tie on a trout fly, and I don't see definition very well on the ground, certainly not in the water. And I don't need to go and plunge 5 feet, by accident. So, but that doesn't mean I don't enjoy it and read it. And I mean, one of my all-time favorite books ever, and I have a funny story about it too, is a river runs through it. And I just loved, and I bought original editions of that book in hardcover. They were so beautifully done. The story was good, but the book production was also good, wonderful. And I gave it to a lot of friends as gifts. Well, at the time I was working promoting Roger Ebert, the movie critic. He was still alive. And there was a party in Chicago. It was a pub party for Roger. And I was sort of standing at the door because it was over in the, I don't know, it's the business club called the Union Club or something like that. And there were several other parties going on in the building. And I wanted to make sure, the people who came to our party weren't supposed to, should be there. So this one guy came walking up. He was very tall. He had hair that stood up a good, it felt like 6 inches over his head. He was very thin. He looked like he might have been caught in a door. And I was just sure this guy did not belong at our party. He just looked a little too alternative. So I kind of approached him and I said, "Excuse me." I said, "Who are you?" And he gave me a name that didn't sound familiar. And I said, "Oh, and why are you here?" He said, "I designed Roger's book." Oh, okay. At this point, I'm embarrassed because I said, "Well, book design is one of my favorite things that I'm interested in. In fact," I said, I don't know if you've ever looked at this book. A river runs through it. It's just so beautifully designed." He said, "I did it." That took care of me. Yeah. Any other questions?
What's the biggest muskie you've got?
How about what my dad caught?
No.
My dad caught a 50.
Nice.
Yeah, and it's in my cabin. Yeah, and it looks like it is 65 years old, but I'm not going to change it. And my parents, it used to be in our dining room of our house, and my parents had a big fight. My mom grabbed that 50-inch muskie off the wall and threw it in the trash, in the garbage. Well, my brother, the one who tells bad jokes, went out and he pulled it out, and he scotch taped the fins back on the fish because they'd been ripped off. Well, so the muskie in my cottage is up there, scotch tape and all. Biggest one I ever caught was a tiger muskie, and not kind of like a large northern. But I did try to fly fish muskie. So
Did you do that new fly fishing that you talked about in your book? Like
tenkara.
Tenkara?
I haven't done it. I've paid a lot of attention to it. I think it's a really good way to go, especially for people, who don't want to get into a lot of the technicalities. So I haven't. But if I were still able to see and everything, as good as you need to, I would try it, definitely. I think it's a really good way to go. And I think there's a lot of support for it around the country.
Any other questions? I had one question. I have more, but I'm going to ask just
No,
one.
you go right ahead.
You mentioned Willa Cather, but then you also, on your website, you have a whole bunch of favorite authors, Edith Wharton, and there's a Rhinelander connection. Tell us a few of the other ones.
Well, I'm rereading one of my absolute favorites right now, and anyone who reads mysteries, if you would like really fine writing, and I mean, I'm coming out of the tradition of, say, Raymond Chandler, Ross Thomas. He died in 1986 or so, but his books are terrific, and he doesn't know it, but he was my mentor. He writes with a lot of wit and a lot of knowledge. His stories are they're good. His characters are great. You can't come up with characters like that unless you've really known those kinds of people. And he had a very interesting career, which is, again, a big reason I think I like him. I think he grew up in Oklahoma, and then he was in the Second World War in the Philippines. And then coming out of there, he did a couple things. He worked in public relations. He was a reporter for a while, and then he became very involved in politics and promoting different candidates running for the U.S. Senate. He had a job promoting a guy in Nigeria who was running for prime minister. He worked all over the country. And then he worked a lot in Washington, D.C. And all of that experience really, and he's got a very shrewd and uncompromising view of people, particularly politicians. And I've worked in politics. I had to lobby in the Missouri Senate. And trust me, there are some not nice people around. And that's true today. And then my daughter, my oldest, up until about 7 years ago, she oversaw U.S. trade with China for commerce. She was just this level below, she was as a civilian, and so she was a level below Assistant Secretary of Commerce. And so I, in doing my PR work, after I left Andrews and McNeil, our firm, I worked for a firm out of Kansas City. We did a lot of work at the Pentagon, and we did a lot of work in different municipalities. And so when I tell you, when I make snide remarks about politicians, it comes out of experience. And, you know, sometimes when you have bad, for me, it's been funny. When you have bad experiences with people, I just all chalk it up to material, good material. So, oh, that was your question.
No, go ahead. One more question and then we'll close.
Your new series and are Doc and Ray in your new series or not anymore?
Everybody's there.
Oh, good.
Yes, and it's set in Loon Lake. The only difference is that Lou Ferris takes a more central role than Doc Osborne did.
And the titles.
Yeah. Yeah, and the title's different. Yeah. Well, to answer your question still, other writers that I like, I love this couple that wrote the Martin Beck detective series, Joel and Walu. They're Scandinavian, and that series is set in Sweden. It's really, really good. And then, of course, I'm sure you're familiar with Henning Mankell, the Kurt Wallander series. You know, there's a woman, her name is Wendy, well, can't remember her last name, but she wrote a book called Scandinavian Noir, and she goes into a number of the different mysteries. I like quite a few of those. And she also in the back has a list of a lot of television series that have been based on some of those or that are unique to Scandinavia. And I can tell you, I don't like, trying to think the guy, well, when stuff gets too graphic, you know, the girl with the dragon tattoo was okay until the second book where she's like jumping in burial sites or something, you know, give me a break. And, oh, I grew up on Father Brown. Yeah, my dad was a mystery reader, and he introduced me to Guy de Maupassant and the Father Brown mysteries. And of course, like everybody, Agatha Christie, Nancy Drew. Yeah.
Well, I need to end this. I would love to hear more stories because they were fascinating and interesting.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and to Brian, who's selling Chapter 2 books, Victoria's books from Chapter 2 books. Best wishes on your future books. I really enjoyed Wolf Hollow, and I'm looking forward to more of those.
Thank you.
You can go to her website. She has some more interesting information out there at victoriahouston.com. And thank you, virtual audience, for tuning in, and the real audience for coming out tonight. My next author event will be virtual and with longtime historian Jerry Apps. He's written numerous books.
He's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you met him?
We've been on panels a couple of
Oh, okay.
times. He is a delight. Yes.
And that'll be on August 11th and August 31st. We finally have Kent Krieger coming back to discuss his latest book. He has another one already out, Fox Creek, it's called. That will be out August 23rd, but he will be here August 31st. So if you need details, go to our website, riverfallspubliclibrary.org, and click on library events. Your support means a lot, and have a great rest of your evening. And thank you again, Vicki.
Oh, you're very welcome. And thank everyone for coming out.